Hello everyone, Nabil Qureshi with Creed 26 Ministries, and welcome to the first in a 9-part series on the basics of Islam. We're calling this Islam 101, and we're hoping that by the time you master the information in these 9 series, you will have been introduced to the religio-political nature of Islam, have a solid grasp on the theological underpinnings of Muslim beliefs and practices, and be more comfortable approaching the Muslim next door. Now the last of these is what we're going to focus on in this first session, but a lot of what we talk about here will feed into what you learn later and vice versa. So after watching the videos that come out later, definitely come back and watch this one. It will probably help you have a better understanding. I also want to let you know that I used to be a Muslim, and so what I'm sharing with you is personal insight into my own past, what I understood of my friends and family around me, and also since then I've spent a lot of time studying the basics of Islam, even in universities, and so I'll also be sharing things that I've learned from an academic setting. One of the first things we should have under our belt is the terminology. Islam versus Muslims. Now Islam refers to the religion, or more specifically the religio-political system, whereas Muslims refer to the people who follow Islam. Now technically the word Islam means submission. It comes from the root word in Arabic Sulm, S-L-M if you want to transliterate that into English. Muslim is one who submits. Now this root word also has other derivatives, and one of them is the word peace, and so you might hear that Islam means peace. It's not technically accurate, but it's close enough. Now this distinction between Muslims and Islam is more than just a curious trivial fact. People tend to follow their religion in different ways. Now some Muslims might see Islam differently because of their presuppositions, or they might see Islam differently because of different amounts of knowledge that they have. Or they might just be devout to a different degree than another Muslim. So we cannot approach all Muslims as if they're the same. You can't approach anyone in a blanket generalizing manner like that, but especially Islam. There's so many different factions and sects that it just wouldn't make sense to see everyone the same way. One example would be me and my sister. Now we both come from the same family. We were raised by the same parents, we lived in the same places, we've been through a lot of the same things, so one would expect that we would perhaps approach Islam the same way. Well, while I was still a Muslim, say while I was in college, I saw Islam as a very legalistic religion, in that we should learn what Muhammad said, we should learn what Muhammad taught and how he lived, and we should follow it. The degree to which we follow Muhammad is the degree to which we're living Islam appropriately. My sister would have seen that as too legalistic. She would say that Islam has a lot more flexibility, has a lot more understanding. She sees it in a more New Age approach, and in fact she would see it slightly more as universalists would see their own faith. So we can't approach Muslims as if they all say the same thing or practice the same thing. There is a significant degree of overlap, but we can't treat them all the same. This brings me to my next point. The Muslim next door. How do you treat them? How do you approach them? My first encouragement to you would be get to know them. There's no way you can know what they believe or what they think or even how closely they adhere to Islam without first getting to know them personally. Now, there are very deep roots in Islam with hospitality. Hospitality finds itself deeply penetrated into the Middle Eastern culture, and that has flowed out, from what I've seen, into a lot of Muslims around the world. And so take heart in that. If you want to open up your home to Muslims, or if they open up their homes to you, definitely take advantage of that and get to know them so that you might be able to learn more about them and share more about your beliefs with them. You might be asking me though, Nabil, is there some common denominator, some factor that tends to explain or describe most of the Muslims in the world? Well, I'll tell you something that my professor at Duke University taught me this year, and I've found it to be true. After about the turn of the 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, a lot of the madhabs, or the 4 major schools of Islamic Sunni thought, began to dissipate. We'll talk more about this in a future session. But what this meant was there was a default that was being reached, and that default has tended to be more along the lines of Ahl Hadith, or Salafi or Wahhabi Islam, and I'm talking about fundamentals. People are trying to get back to what Muhammad taught about Islam, and they're trying to learn from books of hadith, from books of seerah, exactly how Muhammad lived his life, and they're seeing that as the exemplary form of Islam. Now again, we can't say this about everyone, but this is the trend in Islam for the past 100 years or so. And so if you're looking for something to grasp on what a Muslim is probably like, it's a good idea to understand the foundations of Islam, the way Muhammad used to live. That might give you an insight into what Muslims are striving for around the world. As you get to know your Muslim neighbors and friends, you might begin to realize that a lot of their lifestyle is built around their duties as Muslims. For example, when I was a Muslim, much of my life was based around the 5 daily prayers. In the Islamic world at large, you will see a lot of people waking up in the morning due to the first call of prayer of the day. Breaks are taken for prayer, and the end of the workday is often because of prayer. And at nighttime, while sleeping, a lot of Muslims wake up in the middle of the night specifically to pray. So their duties often dictate a lot of how they live their lives. This is also the case for the Muslim calendar as a whole. You might know the Muslim holy month of Ramadan is when Muslims fast, and so you'll see a lot of the Muslim lifestyle built off of their duties as Muslims. Now I would say this has a lot to do with their soteriology, or their doctrine on salvation. It's a very duty-based religion. Now there are principles and tenets that are extremely important to Muslims, but when it comes to everyday life, those tend to take a back seat. They don't dictate specifically the duties Muslims undergo. So you'll see that a lot about the Muslim lifestyle. It's based off of duties. Now, if you get to know your Muslim friends very well, especially if they let you pass their barriers into their heart of hearts, you might come to grasp something about the Muslim mindset. Specifically, Muslims believe, and I'm saying this from experience, personal experience with family, friends, people I've met around the world, stuff I've studied, this is just true. Muslims believe that Islam is superior to all other religions, all other ways of life. Specifically, Muslims would believe that Islam is superior in regards to doctrine, that there is one God, and that one God is not a trinity, and that Muhammad is the chief of prophets, though there are tens or hundreds of thousands of prophets who've come throughout time. They will believe that these kinds of doctrines are superior to other doctrines. Which is fine. Most people believe that their religion is better than everyone else's anyway, so that's not surprising. But what we will see is that this continues on into other realms of their everyday life. For example, most Muslims believe that their rituals are superior to everyone else. That means that if you talk to the average Muslim, they would say that praying 5 times a day the way they pray is superior to any form of prayer outside of that. For example, Christian prayer, they would say, is inferior. Jewish prayer, they would say, is inferior. Not just how often they pray, but also the method of their praying, the manner, the rituals surrounding the prayer. They would say that that's inferior. Again, we can't generalize to all Muslims, but the average Muslim, you would ask, would believe this. The same can be said of the results of the religion. Now, Muslims would say that Islam turns you into a better person. I've seen that argument used to defend the truth of Islam by many, many people. That if you follow Islam the way it's supposed to be followed, you will be a better person than if you follow any other religion the way it's supposed to be followed. This leads to one last thing, which is a controversial statement, but I would say it's very true, and that is that the average Muslim thinks Muslims are superior to everyone else. Now, this is not a standalone claim that Muslims just happen to come up with culturally. This is actually a result of Islamic teachings. Chapter 3, verse 110 of the Quran tells Muslims that they are superior to everyone else. And verses like chapter 98, verse 6 tells everyone that they are inferior to Muslims, especially Jews, Christians, and polytheists. So this concept of superiority is something that we find deeply ingrained in Islam, and we see it in the average Muslim mind. Now, in the West, I would say it's not quite as prevalent. You have people who've been westernized, who have a concept of relativism and universalism. This is not something we find in the history of Islam. This is not something we see before, I would say, the 20th century, the late 20th century, in modern Islam. Finally, I would like to emphasize that there are modern movements in Islam. For example, there's a revisionist movement, Muslims who believe that Islam can be molded to fit contexts, and quite radically so. For example, there's some Muslims who would say that many of Muhammad's teachings no longer hold because we're not living in 7th century Arabia. Now this is something, again, that has just recently taken shape around the world, but we should expect to find something like this every now and then, especially in the West. The same can be said for universalist beliefs. Some Muslims believe that Islam is just one of many paths to God, and therefore that it's not exclusive. Well, this is something that we see again cropping up in the West, but not throughout history, and mostly not anywhere else but in the civilized West. So there you have it, the basics of Islam, an introduction. Hopefully you'll be able to better understand the average Muslim mindset, also how to approach the Muslim next door. Keep in mind that you need to get to know everyone individually, never come to the table expecting how they will be, but having an understanding of what they might believe. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next session on Islam, which will be about the 5 pillars.